You just heard Ian's keynote about ID Pro. ID Pro is now launched. We have some of the founding members here, and we're going to talk about what it means to be an identity professional and some of their experiences. So do you guys want to start with introductions?
Sure. Is this on? There we go. Sorry, technical difficulties. Hi, I'm Dean Saxe. I'm a security engineer with Amazon.com and the infrastructure security team.
Hi, I'm Dasha Cherepennikova. I'm the executive director over at One World Identity, or OWI.
Hi, I'm John Lehtinen. I'm the integrations leader for access management for GE Digital.
And last but not least, Colin Wallis from Kantara Initiative, and I'm their executive director.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. And do you want to talk a little bit about how you got into identity, maybe what your undergraduate degree was, how it led you into this field?
My undergrad degree did not lead me into identity. So I have an undergrad degree in biology and 4 years toward a failed PhD in genetics and molecular biology. So I'm a grad school dropout and found my way to identity through security. I've been involved in InfoSec 15 plus years, and about 5-6 years ago, working at the Gates Foundation, had an opportunity to start working on some identity problems, and that sort of led me to where I am today. I've been doing identity for full time for about 2 years now.
Yeah, and similar to Dean, also my undergraduate degree, not as related to identity. I was a finance and international business major. I used to be a high-frequency equities trader, which is not related to identity. But later on, I became a product manager at Google. And there I was working in both our fraud and risk side, as well as our compliance. So anything that was monetized kind of went through me. And basically what I found is that identity was a very common theme across both preventing fraud as well as ensuring compliance. So compliance for things like regulated products, know your customer, AML, et cetera, as well as access to our own internal tools. And so I basically found myself in identity on accident and was very curious to see how it sort of mirrored against the payments world as well.
My undergraduate degree was in Spanish language and literature from the prestigious Arizona State University. At the time, being young and foolish, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. Thank heavens I avoided that pitfall. Then from there, I started enterprise IT because it was the one marketable skill I had when I decided not to go to law school, and one thing led to another, and eventually I found myself into an identity role, and I've been in that position in identity for 8 years now.
So for me, I was Bachelor of Commerce and double degree in Business Management and Marketing. And so it's quite a long way from identity. It's probably, I'm trying to think now, probably about 2004, I think, that I originally started in the identity space. And that was actually through standards. I was working for the New Zealand government at the time and doing a lot of standards work in various standards consortia. And it was actually through that work, and for those of you who remember, SAML 2, that came out on the 31st of March 2005. And we were building the identity management system in the New Zealand government at the time. And it was, we were in fact, I think, the second in the world to deploy SAML 2.
Awesome. So the way this is going to go is I'm going to ask our panelists some open-ended questions, and then we'll do a blitz round where they only get one word or one phrase to answer a bunch of questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And you guys don't all have to answer, and you certainly don't have to answer in order, but if you have something you want to say about it. So our first question is, what's the best way to train identity teams? Obviously there's no formal, I guess there is a formal degree program now at UT Austin, but until recently, there has been no way to formally get trained in identity. How do you train your teams, and should you cross-train on your team?
Yes, I'll take a quick start. So I think one of the biggest challenges that I see when I see people talking about identity is people use the same vocabulary to mean different things. I think Ian mentioned this a bit during his keynote. If you ask for one definition of a term, you'll come out with 4 if you have if you have 2 people in the room. So one of the key things I think is, especially within a team, is aligning the vocabulary so that you are actually using the same words to describe the same problems. So I kind of joke that I beat out the difference between authorization and authentication on our teams, and if people use them interchangeably, I will jut into the sentence and say, I'm sorry, I think we need to realign. And the reason that is really important is I think a lot of that contributes to successful identity programs, in the sense that if you have two people who come out of a meeting who think they've just agreed on the same thing, and then you go and you have it implemented and you realize you've now implemented two different things, that is obviously a problem. So I would say certainly aligning on vocabulary is a really important step one. So if you do nothing else, make sure that you're using the same words to mean the same things.
I think that's great, actually, and I've run into this quite a lot in my own career. But I would actually extend on something that Ian said this morning about learning from tweets and blogs and and people like Sarah and Dasha. That's how I got myself involved in identity. It was following people on Twitter. It was going to conferences. It was reading papers, and it was mostly bootstrapping myself. The one really valuable thing that I got out of graduate school was the ability to teach myself just about anything that I want to know. So using that ability and bootstrapping from those resources has really helped me. But that doesn't work for everybody else. And so we need to find a way to bring that knowledge, bring that information to others who don't have it yet, and find a way to help them get that knowledge. That's one of the things I hope ID Pro will help us do.
I'm just going to echo the sentiment about how we more or less had to bootstrap ourselves and learn by doing, especially in the enterprise space for somebody who, like me, who did not necessarily aspire to become an identity expert. Especially in enterprise teams, we're focused on actually delivering a product for our customers and more specifically our bosses. And so as we're tasked to solve those problems, we get mired inside of very narrow technical challenges, at least in the enterprise space in my experience. And so as a result, a lot of the learning comes, as Ian said, from working on, from the knowledge manuals and documentation for product-specific implementations of technology, of identity tools, as opposed to actual real content. And I think we all recognize there's a problem there, and I think the only thing we can really do outside of standardizing, like Kevin's, is just contribute back to those who are entering in this with us.
So one of the things I learned along the way with my public sector background, but I also see it applying almost as equally in the private sector, is there's this kind of white space between folks on the technical side and folks that are on the policy side. And that's where a lot of the disconnect comes in. And I certainly saw that that's a real gap. And my sense is that when you arrive at identity, you identify yourself into one of those sort of spaces. Either you're a technical geek and you understand the protocols and things, or you come at identity from a sort of a policy and humanistic sort of kind of direction. And the cross-train answer is right there. You need to have the techs to be trained in the sort of humanity, the humanist side of what identity means in a cultural sense, and vice versa. Those folks need to understand the tech as well to know what's possible, what should be done, what can be done, and so on.
So one of the most difficult things that I've faced as an identity professional is creating a strategy for my organization. I think we've all dealt with that. As we saw from Ian's keynote this morning, identity strategies can take years. And during those intervening years, technologies are going to change, resources are going to change, requirements are going to change. How do you guys approach that problem? Where do you start to create a strategy for your organization?
This is a really tough problem. Working in a large organization like Amazon, we're a Fortune 20 company. There's lots of systems, there's lots of change, there's lots of acquisitions. So the one thing I can always expect is change. I can never expect to get to 100%. If I say my end goal is somewhere out here, I can never expect to truly get there at 100%, and I have to accept the fact there are going to be trade-offs. There are going to be things that are not going to go the way that I want them to go, and I have to be willing to understand what those trade-offs are and be willing to make trade-offs in whatever strategy I devise to ensure that incrementally we continue to improve the state of the art while trying to achieve that nirvana that's somewhere off in the distance that we're probably never going to get to.
And I think to kind of build off of Dean said, the way that I think about this is I have sort of a 4-point framework where I basically draw a square, if you will, and I put privacy on one end, security on another, user experience, and then also cost being both financial as well as time. And I think about whatever we're proposing, and I think about what directions are we moving in all four of those dimensions: privacy, security, user experience, and cost. Obviously, you would want cost to go down, but you kind of want the other elements to go up. And so I say, are we at least moving the needle on two of these elements to kind of be moving in the right direction or not? Because frankly, if you're implementing a more costly solution that's really not, changing your privacy, security, or user experience, you really have to pause and think about, why are you doing this? Or similarly, if your security is moving up, but maybe your user experience is going down or your cost is going up, you kind of really need to think about those trade-offs. And those are all going to be different trade-offs, I think, for every organization. I'm at a very small company, so for us, cost is obviously really important, but we certainly don't want to sacrifice, the other elements of that equation just because, something is cheaper or more cost-effective. And so I think for every organization, kind of how you make those trade-offs is different, but certainly having some kind of a framework for, instead of just jumping on the next solution or the next technology, having a way that you actually evaluate it over and over again so that you're making consistent decisions is really important.
I want to see you give a talk on that next year.
Next year.
That was very good. I would say in an organization where you don't necessarily have the right level of command and control to set the strong identity strategy the way you like to go, it's important that you keep your passion. And since you are here, I assume there's a certain level of passion there. So as you go and operate inside a large enterprise environment, you as the practitioner get to keep the end state in mind, even though your day-to-day requirements, your projects, whatever initiatives you may be currently running at that time, don't necessarily look to that horizon. So it's about adaptability and always being able to look for those opportunities to more or less judo your enterprise with where it needs to go without, even if you don't have that empowerment to set that direction.
So, your strategy is worth absolutely jack if you don't have your customers with you. So whatever your audience is, whether it's end users or it's an enterprise where you've got your employees, at the end of the day, you've got to satisfy their requirements, because if you are not going to get adoption for your strategy, if you're not going to get take-up, then it means nothing. It has failed. So to Dasha's UX, cost, privacy, security, I would add interoperability. Because I think that you're only as good as the next standard, as the next wave. You've got to be able to build your structures so that they're flexible. You can configure things in and out almost on a button change. So, from my sense, I think that your strategy has to absolutely be tied really tightly to your end user, your market.
So in the field of identity right now, it seems like there's a lot of demand and not a lot of supply of professionals who know this stuff, which is great for me as an independent consultant, but not great for the field as a whole. How can we cultivate talent? What should we as an industry be doing above and beyond what we're doing now?
Well, we've started, right? This is a classic, and of course, it's not as if this approach is particularly new. It's just applying it to a new discipline. You've got the IAPP, you've got ISC squared and security, ISACA. You've got a whole bunch of these industry professional organisations, and this is a good start. It's probably not the only start, though, and I think that my sense is that the discipline, because it's going to become such an integral part of doing business online, I think we're going to end up with you need to kind of pick up that cross-training idea as well, and I think the way to cultivate talent is actually to cycle folks, part of your team actually through an identity phase. I would say it's not the only phase that they should be through. They should make sure they're in access management, they're in privacy, they're in security. But it's a matter of cycling your folks across different disciplines, but measure their success, measure their intuitive ability and intuitive understanding of the subject. And that's the way you'll probably pick those. They'll almost self-select, right?
I think one thing I would add to that is I see identity as a collaborative sport, is the way that I call it. And I think that, folks that are sort of building identity solutions or implementing identity solutions, I call it in a closet, but also in a vacuum, by yourself, in a box, any of those things, are not likely to be successful. I think there really is a huge opportunity from learning from one another and from collaborating. As an example, one thing that OWI does is we have working groups of folks in the industry. So for example, financial services or telecommunications that actually come together and kind of share best practices and talk with one another as a way of having sort of a more formal collaboration and a formal kind of, convening where we're facilitating a little bit of the knowledge and sharing and best practices. And events like the Cloud Identity Summit and others are also a great place to do that, because then there's a huge opportunity for us to be learning from one another. So the same way that Colin talked about kind of cycling the teams internally, I think it's really important to do that externally as well. As much as I think all of us would like to think that there's some secret sauce to this, I think like I said, I think it's really a collaborative game where we're all learning from one another. It's a rapidly developing field, and sharing all of that information I think is really important.
Anybody else?
Yeah, real quick. Something that attracted me to identity when I first started was the nebulous nature of it. There was a philosophy component in there outside of the technical. When people talk about the identity, they're talking about the core of their beings. You can tap into that when you talk about presenting yourself, your persona to a security system, a government, anything like that. If we want to track folks into this, I think as technologists, we probably want to not lose sight of the philosophical component there, because that carries an inspiration more so than OAuth profiles, as cool as they are, never will.
Hey, don't diss OAuth profiles. If I'm a young professional and I don't quite know what I want to do, but I know that I want a job somewhere in identity, what should I do to prepare myself for that, to become a good candidate to be hired on an identity team?
This is a tough one, but I think for me, from my background being in security, I think security is a great place, a great launching place, right? I work with security, I work with privacy. Those naturally fit with identity. And so from that perspective, it's one approach that you can take to getting into the industry. It's one approach that you can take to thinking about identity on a global basis or on a corporate basis, or however you think about it. But I think that's a great place to start.
I think something that's exciting about this, but is also challenging, is because so many parts of identity are brand new, right? These are jobs that sort of have never existed before. So you can't really say, I'm going to find someone who has 30 years of experience doing X. There are very few parts of identity that are like that today. So I think an important part is also kind of helping people balance the depth and breadth, and always continuing to learn in both directions, because depth being sort of like, okay, I'm going to become an OAuth 2 expert, right? But breadth is, I'm going to be aware of everything that's happening, whether it's in identity or access management or customer identity or identity and relationship management, or any of these sort of adjacent topic areas, because there's a lot there. So I advise people to sort of balance between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's one way of looking at of answering this is, what do I need on my CV? What's going to be the thing that that a potential employer picks up and says, yep, I can sort of, before ID Pro, right? I can see that this person's been around. And I think you need to immerse yourself in, in working groups, in industry consortia, contribute to specifications. It's, and start in that sense to sort of get to evidence your name into something. It may start as a very very minor role and a part to play, but over time you can spread your own wings, build your own sense of identity in the identity business, and move towards speaking slots and blogs and those sorts of things. But I think it's important to share your journey transparently in blogs, written, online, social, anyhow, somehow.
And sorry, I'm actually just going to build off of what Colin said. And I think especially for young people, this can be very daunting. As someone who's relatively young in my career, sometimes I feel like, I'm in a room and what credibility do I bring to this conversation? And I think what's really exciting about a lot of different technology spaces, but especially digital identity, is kind of like I mentioned before, there is no sort of like quote unquote expert or this sort of really long history, and so there's a lot of people who are young in their careers who have a lot of great ideas. And so if you're one of them, I would definitely encourage you, to Colin's point, start getting yourself out there, get into those speaking slots, get into publishing or into contributing to the specifications. I think don't feel like just because you're a relative newcomer to the space that you're not yet in a position to add to the conversation. I think that that's a false dichotomy.
So curiously, I think and curious, I'd argue the curiosity, right? Since, again, this is a relatively young space, technologically speaking, we're a sea of mid-level career professionals here, and though there's several outliers we all look to, we all have a chance to contribute and help build this thing that, though we're doing enterprise identity fairly well, there's the additional facets of identity that people like me hadn't even considered in my day-to-day scope of what my responsibilities are. So to somebody looking to break in, I think we might be doing ourselves a disservice if we really only look for folks who really want to be an identity. I think we could bring fresh perspectives and fresh insights from people with areas of expertise outside of just those security domains, outside of those technology domains. Again, liberal arts major here. I think there's ways of thinking which are underrepresented inside of the STEM fields, and I think those things could enrich the tapestry of the identity discussion. So don't be intimidated if you're not somebody who already knows directory services or something starting in. I think there's a whole lot of value to be offered by just approaching the identity field.
And one comment on Colin's comments, there are a lot of people in identity who are working behind the scenes, who are never going to be up here on a panel like this or standing up like Ian did a little while ago. That's just not their role. That's not what they're comfortable with. Maybe they're introverts. That doesn't mean that they too can't contribute to this society. They can't contribute to the profession. They hold a very different kind of a role, but they will still be there and be active. And so just because somebody doesn't have on their resume or their CV a long history of speaking engagements or other types of things doesn't mean they haven't been active and done great work. You have to find other ways to communicate that. I can't directly communicate about the work that I do in security at my company when I'm going to look for another job or when I'm trying to get onto a panel or something like that. So I have to find other ways to communicate my knowledge and where I've been and what I've done without directly referencing those things that are privy only to my employer.
You guys are being really nice to each other. It's okay to get into arguments. Maybe I can spark some. Let's see. Okay, how about this? Where do you guys see identity in 10 to 20 years? What does maturity look like for this field? Do we go more in the direction of the web where like the general public knows what it is, they know how to configure it? Do we go in the direction of like networking where we're completely invisible, but we have a whole bunch of experts who just make the thing work? Where are we going? How do we get there as an industry?
I'm going to take a first crack. We go in the direction of plumbing. And the reason that I say that is I think that we need it to quote unquote just work, right? As an end user of plumbing, such as toilets and sinks, I have certain expectations for what those devices do when I go use them, and I know how to make some subtle changes like the temperature of the water. And it usually works, and if it doesn't, hopefully I'm calling a plumber. But I don't need to go in there and understand every time I want to use a sink or toilet exactly how to use it. And I think that that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for identity is we want, I think that identity is everywhere, and putting the burden on an end user to be able to understand all of those things every time they have an identity interaction is frankly ludicrous. And so I would challenge all of us to have the mindset of how can you approach whatever you're doing with the simplicity of it working like plumbing, and having an interoperable understanding of how these different things work. So regardless of what, frankly, brand of toilet or sink fixture you're using, or whether it's Chrome or how it looks, that you sort of understand how it works and have those paradigms, and it's just as simple to use.
Yeah, I would absolutely go along with that. I think it's going to end up to being a self-controlled ubiquity. I think that I think the ultimate the ultimate is if we can all do ourselves out of a job. And I'm really being serious. I mean, I think that there's a real danger that we can self-perpetuate this problem and call it a problem and a complex problem, and an even more complex problem way after it actually is not so much of a problem. So I think we've got to be careful and mindful of understanding that we're in a moment of time, and that this moment is now we do have to solve, in speech marks, the identity problem, but there will be a time when it's solved and we leave it. Just, I don't know if Steve Wilson's in the audience. Most of you must know Steve Wilson, loudmouth Aussie, right? Now, Steve, of course, is one that doesn't keep his views to himself. Go and ask him about the identity problem and just block your ears, because what'll come back will be a barrage of, how damn complex actually is it? I can understand attributes and access control, but how damn complex is identity? I think you guys are overblowing it, and you're trying to create an industry, in a sense, out of one that doesn't need to be forever and ever. Does now, but not forever and ever.
Nobody's going to challenge that statement? I think we can be an industry forever and ever, but I'm not a panelist.
Fight. All right. Fair. Yes, and as somebody who has worked to not support things, teams, and services that shouldn't exist forever, I'm on board with that. That said, I certainly hope that we don't attain a certain level of transparency and taking for grantedness of identity. Like we look towards things, and the Silicon prophets say, machine learning is going to make sure we can always contextually be identified by our walk, our speech, what have you. I have an issue with being watched over by machines of loving grace. I would like a human face at some point to intervene, and so I think there may need to be a human intervention, or even if artificially constructed, a human governance process on top of whatever touchless, featureless, and transparent plumbing we're working towards building.
I would tend to agree with John on that privacy becomes a bigger and bigger issue as we get further down this path. I think right now, we've trained everyone to love their biometrics, right? You have an iPhone and you use biometrics to authenticate to your phone or your Android device. You've got Touch ID on a MacBook now, and it's become this almost ubiquitous thing in Western society to use biometrics. What happens when there is an attack across multiple platforms that compromises everybody's biometrics? I can't rotate my 10 fingers, right? So how do we begin to deal with these problems, and how do we think about these problems? So Colin suggests that eventually this problem will go away. I think the problem just changes over time.
And I would agree with that in kind of going back to my plumbing analogy, right? I think we need to be really cognizant of the underlying technology and the fact that it's always changing, right? We had a conversation earlier about it sort of always being a moving target. And so, back in the day, lead plumbing or asbestos-wrapped plumbing, was state of the art, and we've sort of realized that's no longer something that we want to be doing. And today, we're excited about certain technologies that 10, 20, even 5 years down the line, may no longer be. So I would say that it is, to some extent, a job that is never going to be done. So I'll disagree a little bit, but I do think that we are often over-engineering and overcomplicating our own lives in some of the solutions that we're building. So I do think that there is a huge opportunity for kind of simplifying that down and getting to a better, steadier state, but then being cognizant that the technology is always going to change out from under you. There will always be new threats, especially as we look at sort of the security landscape or different user attitudes or user expectations that we're going to have to adjust to over time.
So I'm curious to hear from each of you. What do you feel like is your biggest accomplishment as an identity professional? Was there one thing you did where you got it done and you thought, oh, this is the field that I want to be in. I love this field. I want to spend the rest of my career here. Or was there something that really moved the needle for your users? What was that point in your career and your experiences?
So this kind of gets back to what I was talking about earlier, that we can't always talk about the things that we do. So I would say this right here is the highlight of my identity career. I mean, I've been around this industry for 5 or so years. Like I said, I've been actively 100% involved for about 2 years now. So getting the opportunity to come here and hang out with you guys and talk a little about ID Pro is great. If you ever come work at Amazon, I'd be happy to talk to you about some cool things I'm doing there, but I just can't do that today.
Yeah, I mean, to Dean's point, this is, it's a very personal thing, right? I'm, not exactly the youngest person in this room, right? So towards the end of, towards the end of my working life, I mean, this has to be a highlight. Just as actually, when I started in identity, when, I wrote the first standards for the New Zealand government, the SAML profile, NZ SAMS, that was a highlight as well, because it was very early times, and so often you remember the things, you remember the first thing, and you remember the later things. I don't know what's going to happen after my time at Kantara is finished, and hand over the reins to somebody else. But this is certainly for the what's it, close on 15 years, I suppose, that I've been working in identity. I suppose if I go back even before some of the work at New Zealand government, I think that there's a sort of a period of time when it feels that you're in the peak, and you can still actually contribute a whole lot in a very different kind of way. That's not upfront in your face and very present. I mean, going back to Dean's point about being in the background, and I think that's just as valuable.
I think for me, frankly, the greatest accomplishment was realizing that I was even in this field. I kind of mentioned I was working in something completely different before I realized that I was even in identity. So I think, step one is admitting that you have an identity problem. And so I think I'm there and really looking forward to contributing more to this community.
I think it's kind of an interesting thing that across the panels here, we're saying that, being able to participate in these kind of forums is actually a high point of our career. And I don't say that in like an egotistical fashion. I really mean that as the bar is so remarkably low and your potential for impact is so high that you could be everything you want to be and peak so early, and then hopefully be continue to carry those growings and learnings and executions throughout your entire working career. But I would just say that there's a wealth of opportunity to be very impactful in this industry for very minimal effort. In terms of actual professional accomplishments that I actually really am proud of, working with folks like Pat Lundy right here, we got a 125-year-old behemoth of an organization out of an obsolete, deprecated access management system and pivoted them 100% towards fully automated and self-service enabled OpenID Connect and SAML authentication for their apps and APIs. I mean, it's prodigious. And so that was very satisfying to see that, again, we of somewhat humble means here can actually still have a very big impact on a very significant organization.
Okay, and then to flip that around, personal challenges that you've encountered in your identity career, or that you see other teams commonly encountering.
So for me, the biggest challenge is, I come from a technology background. There's a lot of policy and law and other types of things that get way outside of technology that aren't my forte. They're not what I'm good at. And so I have to lean on others, and I think one of the strengths I bring to the table is knowing who to go to in the organization when I have a question about GDPR or about privacy or other issues that maybe I'm not as familiar with and I need more cross-training. I know where to go and find those resources, and I can learn from them, but I will never be an expert in those things. And as somebody who spends a lot of time reading and researching and doing those things, it frustrates me to know that I'll never be an expert in those things, but I can't be an expert in everything. I've got to pick and choose my battles, and that's one of the battles that I'm not going to fight. I'm going to leverage the folks who do that full time.
I think again it's very contextual and very personal. Depending on the path you've chosen and the direction in life. I mean, I've found that much of the challenge, I think the challenges are slightly different in the public sector than they are in the private sector. You know, there's a lot of the case, I think, is the way to explain things, the way of explaining things, that you to try and get some of the concepts across to people who have no real understanding of the space you're in, where you're coming from. And I think that's probably if I think about it over the years, that's been the biggest challenge. You can, when you've got people on your, on your wavelength, you can approach them with, policy and regulation, and they can understand it, or they can approach them technically, they can understand it. But if the receiver of your message is just in a completely different, has no sort of kind of connection with what you're talking about, it's very hard to find the right words that unlocks that mind.
I think to build off that, in addition to finding the right words to unlock that, I think a large challenge is also quantifying. So again, coming kind of from a payments background, it was really easy to quantify and say, if I reduce your false declines by X%, this is how much money this organization is going to make or save. And I think in identity, especially when you get into some of the things like regulatory or privacy, or some of these things that are a lot harder to quantify, how do you make an argument for a particular path of implementation or changing something when you kind of don't have some of those hard numbers? And so I think kind of to some extent inventing frameworks or inventing and communicating out with the right words to the right stakeholders how you're thinking about the problem, even if it doesn't boil down to dollars and cents or a percentage year-over-year change in metric X, is really important. And figuring out what are those things that resonate with your internal and external stakeholders is a large and very frustrating game of trial and error.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it has come time for the lightning round. So our panelists each get one word or a phrase to answer this question. An undergraduate recently asked me what other fields he should be studying if he wants to be a successful candidate to an identity team. What other fields do you feel like identity overlaps with?
Philosophy.
Ooh.
Any hard science.
Hard science.
She stole my answer.
I'd go soft. I'd go humanistics, personally. I think that's where you start.
Humanistics?
Yep.
Excellent. Aside from moderating panels, what's the best way to network with identity people?
Beer.
More beer.
Using beer to overcome your fear of social situations and talking with people.
There's no answer that can follow any of those.
So Dean, Dasha, and I are all Seattle-based, and there's a Seattle IAM meetup, so we spend a lot of time drinking beer together in real life.
And it's very effective.
It's true. What's going to be the most disruptive thing in the identity field in the next 10 years?
I alluded to this earlier, but a massive disclosure of biometrics. So someone who has a huge store of biometrics having that lost.
Globally changing user expectations that are pulling in different directions.
When we break public-private key cryptography.
Ooh, that's what keeps me up at night. Like.
Yeah, I think it's all of those. I think that there are some deep technical issues still to come up, and it's one of those.
Lightning round. Colin.
Oh, sorry, right, lightning round. World War IV.
Pick an issue. World War IV.
I want to change my answer to quantum cryptography.
Yeah, well, that's breaking, yeah. Okay, what is the best part about working in identity? You're not allowed to say
All
beer.
of these people.
All these people.
And beer.
Aww. And beer.
Job security.
True story.
Infinite capacity for learning new things.
Absolutely.
Relating to people. It's a people business.
Okay, we are going to take questions from the audience. Does anybody have a mic? Is there somebody in the back, a ping person with a mic? Do I need to come
We
around
can
with
share
a
this
mic?
one.
It's pretty loud, Sarah.
No, but we're being recorded.
Oh, okay.
We'll repeat your
We'll
question.
repeat, yeah. And then we're going to have them answer a final joke question, which is, what should the theme of next year's CIS be? So we'll give them time to think about that during audience questions. But yeah, please.
So I've noticed just kind of, we talk about identity, but I've noticed there's kind of other parts of it that aren't included, like anything physical access or anything dealing with travel, border crossing, travel, presentation of physical documents, like the nightclub example. So I'm just curious on kind of this, my 2 cents, this is like a subset of really when you talk about identity, it really means all of it. So I was just kind of curious how the plan is maybe to reach out to these other things that are identity, but may not be strictly dealing with, you're talking about a browser or strictly online.
So the question is, we deal a lot here at the Cloud Identity Summit with online identity. How do we interact with people who are doing offline identity and getting into people's daily lives and physical security, things like that? How do we interface with those sort of adjacent fields?
So I think there's already a natural alignment with some of those fields. I mean, physical security, think about things like adaptive access control, where if I know that you have walked into a building because you've badged in with a Linnell badge into a building at a certain period in time, and then I see you pop up online from 5,000 miles away an hour later, I know that's not physically possible. So there is clearly already a tie there, but I do think it's incumbent upon us to reach out to those teams. Like we have a physical security team that I reach out to and work with on some of these things, because there are overlapping concerns that we have, and I want to make sure that they understand what systems we're building internally and how they can leverage them to improve physical security. And conversely, I want to understand what systems physical security has that I can use to leverage for part of our online security.
So you're quite right. Is that going?
You broke it.
Yep, definitely broke it.
There you go. Hello?
Well, your point, it's just me, right? Okay, so your point is quite valid, that, identity is typically a precursor to access control and authorization and entitlements. And we shouldn't forget that. We should forget that we're part of a chain. And I just because it hasn't been mentioned, it doesn't mean to say it hasn't been thought about. It's just that the conversation is geared towards online identity because that's the nature of this conference. But if you were to ask any of us, I would like to think that we would say, yeah, we've got a reasonably good knowledge how to do identity proofing. After all, before you even get to online identity, you've actually got to you've got to evidence that it is the right person, and that's way before you are binding a credential to them. And you would like to think that we're also, have a good understanding of what comes at the other end, after the identity authentication, authorization, what happens to the life cycle of those credentials and so on. So it's a fair point. It's a fair point. But just because it hasn't been mentioned doesn't mean to say we're not thinking about it.
Yeah, I actually really love this question. I think the convergence of physical and digital is really, really interesting, and especially when we think about the physical upgrades to systems. So someone mentioned, one of the biggest threats is PKI and breaking PKI. Well, guess what? What are all of our badge readers? For those of us that work in offices, we have to badge in. That's PKI, right, too? And replacing those physical systems is going to be a lot more costly, actually, than replacing a lot of our digital systems. And so I think, to Dean's point, learning from one another on the physical and digital access and authorization side is going to be critically important so that we can all march lockstep, especially against challenges such as, upgrading PKI across the board in both physical and digital systems.
Awesome. Yes.
I kind of got Ian off guard with this one at the end of his message, but he talked about there's no organizations that do identity stuff at the moment. Well, I'm a member of the Identity Management Institute, specifically the Certified Identity and Access Manager credential. What's the difference between what we're hoping to do with ID Pro, which I'm not a member of, and CIM? What's the difference between the two organizations and what they're striving for?
So the question is generally about the ID Pro organization. How is it different from the Identity Management Institute and the CIAM certification? Do you guys want to, should I just take that?
That was all you.
I think I've been more involved in Colin can take that too.
Well, I mean, it's been a while since I looked, at the Identity Management Institute, I have to say, but we did at the beginning, and my sense was that it was quite restrictive. It was quite narrow in its focus. It was a classic sort of kind of security, pull the identity pieces out of security, and that's absolutely not what ID Pro is going to be about. It's not that. It's a much broader umbrella of different non-security related things.
Right, so Identity Management Institute kind of grew out of identity theft area and security area. We're kind of hoping to have a more CIS-like organization where it's a lot about usability, privacy, about people and community. So I think there's space for both organizations. Yeah, go in the back.
Hi, I feel like I've been teased with the introduction of ID Pro. Is there going to be an opportunity to deep dive that topic a little bit somewhere? I thought maybe after this panel would be, I mean, I have a lot of questions about scope, the nature of the definition of the body of knowledge, just all kinds of questions now. Where do I get a chance for me as attendees and get a chance to know?
Well, quickly go to Kantara's website.
Repeat the question. We're being recorded.
Sorry.
You can
So the question was where to find out more about ID Pro for a deep dive. You know, of course, the organisation's 3 days old, 4 days old. But you know, of course, it's been incubated for a year in Kantara. So go to KantaraInitiative.org and go to resources. Actually go to Wiki and find the Digital Identity Professionals Discussion Group, and then you'll see all that work. It's going to be taken across to the ID Pro website in the fullness of time, but it's not there yet.
Yeah, but I guess my question was more, is there anything planned to offer an interactive chance to learn about it more here?
Get beer with one of us. The question is, how do we learn more? Is there an interactive thing? No, there is not an interactive thing planned at the conference. We should have done that. There's still time. But yes, obviously, we're all happy to drink beer with identity professionals and talk about ID Pro, and so catch one of us.
Perhaps we should try and do something tonight. Haven't we got the cocktail party tonight?
I'm going to a baseball game. I don't know what you're doing.
Isn't there?
That's right.
There's certainly something going on tonight, right?
Yeah.
I've got a question. So I travelled halfway around the world, Colin. The only Kiwi I've met so far is you, and I used to work with you. So tell me what you think ID Pro's role is going to play within government.
So the question is, what role will ID Pro play within government?
Well, you know, fortunately, I've left government now, so I can be mean. But I think one of the things that government always, struggles with when it grapples with a new area is trying to box it in some way. And I think it'll really help. It'll help government to be able, as it will for the private sector actually, to be able to review CVs and applications and be able to, at least put a checkbox against. Okay, well, if they're a member of this thing, and it's the deep dive conversation, right? There's going to have to be there are going to be grades of membership of ID Pro. So anyone can join up just simply because they're interested, and that's absolutely fine. I'm happily take your money, but the point is that further up that scale, and that's a marketing job that's ahead of us. Further up that scale, you're going to have to have you're a certified identity professional, so you're going to have letters after your name or whatever. So I think that government particularly is going to be fond of that, because we've seen them do that with privacy and security. So they're used to pigeonholing people by their qualification.
Yes.
First of all, congratulations to all of you for ID Pro doing right. My question is in the line of CISSP certification, is there anything you are thinking of?
So the question is there anything we're thinking of in the same line as a CISSP certification?
Yeah.
I don't think we've gotten that far in the thought process yet. We want to have a body of knowledge first, so I think we want to go more in a PMP direction, where we have a body of knowledge and we have professionals who have established careers and take certification kind of from that direction.
I think that, it's a fair point. I think we're hesitant to answer it because we don't want to, predict or otherwise preempt what the industry actually wants. So got to be a little careful there.
Yeah. Yes.
In some of the other talks, I've heard about mature processes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that kind of contradicts what you guys say earlier. This is so new. How do we gauge maturity in an infancy stage?
Ooh, that's a good question. So we've talked a lot about identity maturity and becoming a mature discipline. How do we know what maturity looks like given that we're so young as a field? Is that?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
I might give a plug for Sarah's later talk on agile product development. I think it's applying the tools that we already have, right, in other disciplines, whether that's on the more technical side or on the product management side or on the sales side or any of those things, and applying it to this field. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel just because we say we're new. It doesn't mean that we're always a special snowflake that has to like invent processes out of nowhere, right? I think that there are lots of opportunities to kind of adapt and see if it works. And in different organizations, I think, kind of going back to Colin's earlier points around stakeholders, right? Within different organizations, I bet all of us sit within very, very different organizations within our organizations, right? And what kind of influence we have either up or across. And I think anything that you do will kind of need to be adapted to the nuances of your own. I sit in a very small organization. We have only 7 people. So for us, it's a lot easier to do things like influence, right? But I would imagine that somewhere like Amazon or someone at GE is going to have a radically different experiences, and so the tool set that you might pull from could be very different.
Yeah, carrying on from that point, even just looking for my 4 years at GE, what was the mature best practice in 2013 was definitely not the mature best practice in 2017. So that's kind of the thing we get to ride. We saw LDAP binds and directories for the longest time. We saw web access management. We saw federated stuff with SAML, and then finally we moved on to tokenization. And now we're talking about bindings and security enhancements on top of that tokenization. So in terms of something being the best, I think the best you can do is look at what is the best tool for the use case for this period of time. What has the maturity as the right tool in my toolbox, God help us, or a product or what have you. Preferably, what standards can we drive to that will be considered the best practice for now, and then also having the agility to pivot and being able to move to what is new. And I think you'll find that if you adhere to the best standards, the standards we're working to develop, or things like OAuth and SAML, that then swinging over to that new thing becomes a lot easier, because when you're standards based, big parts of organizations, big parts of solutions are interchangeable. So you can always redefine what the best practice is, at least from an implementation perspective.
And I think this gets back to what I was saying earlier, that we're never going to get to 100% of what we want in any large organization. Maybe in Dasha's org she can because it's so small. But in a large organization, you're never going to fully get there. And so I think John has the right idea that moving towards standards-based protocols, SAML, OpenID Connect, OAuth, et cetera, using those, and then through the power of the market, making those better options internally. So instead of binding directly to AD or binding to LDAP, using federation, so that now as I want to go and change out how we do authentication or how we do multi-factor auth or whatever it is, I have one point in my infrastructure that I have to change, and everything else follows along with that. That to me strikes me as getting to a level of maturity that most organizations don't have. So you have to look at maturity within your own organization and not necessarily against a bar that Ian sets or Sarah sets or somebody else sets. You've got to think about what's important to you and how you get to your goals, and that's where you measure maturity against.
I'm going to jump back into the question and take it at a slightly different, in a slightly different direction, and that's, with ID Pro self-analyzing itself and determining, whether it's whether it itself, looking at itself, is it mature. And one of the ways it might do that would be benchmarking itself against the IAPP, ISACA, and IC Squared. And because we've seen, those organisations are much more mature than ID Pro now, and yet, you can imagine that the three disciplines are going to have to work very closely together going forwards. because they're going to have to be it's not a competition, but it is a way in which between the three disciplines they've got to cover the ground and not leave gaps. So my sense is that there will be a lot of looking, not over the shoulder, but sideways at our colleagues in those other organisations to determine whether, look back at ourselves and see if we're mature or not.
And I'm going to add a really boring answer, which is documentation. Every time you're making a decision, write what you thought the trade-offs were and why you decided to go a certain way. That way, next time you encounter having to make this decision, you have to rehash the entire conversation over again. You have a frame of reference, especially if your team has grown or changed since then, to understand why you made the choices that you made the first time around. And whether the assumptions that you made were correct. I think that that's something in a new field that's really important.
Okay, now we get to find out what you guys think will be the theme at next year's CIS. But before that, please do join IDPro, idpro.org/join. Go to the Contact Us page if you are interested in being a founding corporate member. You get memberships along with that, along with a bunch of other perks. Was there anything else I was supposed to plug? No. The Twitter, idpro_org is the Twitter account. When you join, you'll get a little badge that you can put on Twitter and show people that you're a founding member. And with that, we are going to take a 10-minute break, and then I will be back in here to talk about project management, because this is the Sarah Squire track this morning, apparently. And what should be the theme of next year's CIS? Dean?
Beers with Identity Professionals.
Yay!
Plumbing.
Using agile machine learning to blockchain your knowledge graphs.
Oh, nice.
Limitless identity.
Nice. All right, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you guys for coming.